So Avatar is filled with powerful and broken characters who can do just about anything, and among them there are of course the Airbenders, who for the most part are potentially my favourite bending group of all. And sure, among them we all know the big guns such as Toph, King Bumi, Ghazan, and of course who can forget the mighty Boulder. But something many of you might not be actually completely aware of is the fact that there are actually over 30 Airbenders seen throughout both series that impact the story in more ways than I can count. But now if you don't remember them all, fear not, because today we're actually going to go through every last one of them and explain all of the most impactful Airbenders to ever exist. And of course in doing this we just have to start off with the first two people to ever actually learn the art at all, Oma and Shu. Now the lovers Oma and Shu were the first humans ever to learn earthbending, learning it directly from the badger moles themselves. This was of course while they were trapped in the mountain that they used to meet up in secret. For you see, while deeply in love with one another, they came from different tribes that were currently at war with each other for the last few years. Meaning in true Romeo and Juliet fashion, these two lovers had to meet up somewhere in secret, somewhere no one would or could ever find them. Now after some time in doing this, they learnt the art of earthbending by observing the badger moles and creating elaborate tunnels within the mountain that they used to meet up in. And everything appeared to be going really well for them until the fateful day when Shu was killed in the war between both villages. Now devastated by her loss, Oma unleashed her earthbending skills on both of the villages, destroying them and declaring an end to the war, joining together both villages and creating a new city where everyone could live peacefully in coexistence. This great city would eventually go on to become known as Oma Shu, as a monument to the two lovers, Oma and Shu. But now moving on, I think it's only right that the next Earthbender that we explain in this video is potentially the best and most impactful one of all time. And not to mention simply just one of the best characters that we have ever seen in the entire show. And no, it's not the mighty Boulder, although I can see why you'd believe him to be one of the best characters of all time. No, the character that I'm actually talking about is the Blind Bandit, aka Toph Beifong. Now of course she's a character that needs no real breakdown or explanation, but for the sake of the video and because I just love glazing her and her abilities, I'm just going to give her one anyway. So with that said, Toph Beifong was a blind girl from a very wealthy earthbending family. However, being the charismatic tomboy that she was, and having learned the art of earthbending from her friends the badger moles, she wanted to become more than people's preconceived perception of who she was. She wanted to grow and become the best earthbender to ever live. So with that goal in mind, she began entering and dominating many of the earthbending tournaments within her city, which is also where she'd one day go on to meet and join Avatar Aang and his team Avatar. Now she'd then go on to not only teach Aang the way of earthbending, but also aid greatly in the Fire Nation's defeat, learning and becoming the first metal bending master along the way. She'd then go on to later teach this technique to many other earthbenders around, and eventually make what would become known as a kind of police force made up of metal bending officers in Republic City. However, sometime after Aang's death and the arrest of one of her daughters, she realized that no matter how hard she may try, crime and injustice would just never end. So following this realization and in her efforts to constantly grow as an earthbender, she decided to move away and live out the rest of her life in the swamp, where its network of routes and finds allowed her to sense a vast area and even entire cities, giving her a new and unique powerful connection to the world around her. Now towards the end of The Legend of Korra, she did go on to rejoin with Katara and the others in their time of peace, and it is presumed by many in the community that this is where she stayed and lived out the rest of her days until her death. But again, that's not really confirmed at this time, and it's just kind of something that we all want to believe. But now with the brilliant Toph Beifong out of the way, let's cover the earthbender that many actually consider to be her equal, the crazy King Bumi. Now King Bumi was Aang's childhood friend and eventually someone who grew up to become the king of the entire Oma Shu kingdom. He was immensely powerful and is still widely considered by many in the community to be potentially the most powerful earthbender to have ever lived. He'd go on to aid in the ending of the 100-year-long war with his efforts in the liberation of Oma Shu and Ba Sing Se, declaring himself the world's greatest earthbender in the process. Which of course Toph happened to hear and understandably started to question if that was actually true. Which then obviously resulted in the two having a duel to truly decide who the best really is. However, the match was soon called off and declared a draw due to Katara and the others breaking it up to focus on more important things. The two then declared that they would have to have a rematch again one day. But as of right now, and from what we know so far, it has never happened. And sadly, it isn't likely to ever actually happen, as King Bumi went on to die sometime before 124 AG. Which means if they didn't have the rematch between the ending of the 100-year-long war and Zuko's coronation, it isn't likely to have ever happened. But now with that said, let's just quickly move on and explain both Lin and Suyin Beifong, the daughters of Toph Beifong and two of the baddest earthbenders around. So Lin is of course the firstborn daughter to Toph and one of the most crucial characters in the entire Legend of Korra. She was the chief of police of Republic City and a very gifted metal bending master. She took her role as the police chief incredibly seriously and was renowned for her efforts in managing peace and law within Republic City. However, due to this dedication to the rules and the laws around her, she fell out with and continued to have a very strained relationship with both her mother and her half-sister, not speaking to either of them for many years. However, they would go on to make up much later in the show when the situation at hand required them to do so. Now, she'd then go on to aid Team Avatar in many trials and tribulations, and from what we can gather, continued to do so even after the show concluded. However, as for her half-sister, well, she was the founder and leader of the Sao Fu, and just like her mother and sister before her, was renowned for her prowess in the art of earth and metal bending. She was happily married to a man named Batar, with whom she would go on to have 5 children. Children who she was considered to be very protective of. She played an important role in many of the show's biggest moments, such as the defeat of both the Red Lotus and the defeat of Kuvira herself. However, later after this defeat, Suyun would go on to join both her mother and half-sister in leaving a lasting positive impact on the Earth Kingdom and its people, even once bringing Kuvira back to sanity by never giving up on her and supporting her both during and after her trial. But now, speaking of Kuvira and all the shit that she eventually did in The Legend of Korra, let's cover her next and explain who exactly she was. So Kuvira was and is arguably one of the best and most gifted metal benders around, giving every avatar and bender that came her way an incredibly hard time. She's hard-headed and driven, and someone who served as a politician and a military leader for the Earth Kingdom and the entire Earth Empire between 171 and 174 AG. She was taken in, trained and raised by Suyin Beifong before later setting out towards her own goals of reuniting the entire kingdom with her army. This of course eventually earned her the title of the Great Uniter. However, somewhere along the way, her actions would turn from something noble and just to something corrupt and evil. All the way until the end of her reign, after she was defeated by Avatar Korra in the Republic City and imprisoned for her many actions. However, later, due to some efforts by Suyin Beifong, she was sentenced to house arrest and given into the custody of the Beifong estate, with Suyin Beifong once again being placed in charge of all of her actions. Moving on, and up next on our list is Bolin, the Earthbender on Avatar Korra's Team Avatar. Now, Bolin was an Earthbender from a multicultural family and someone who, alongside his bending brother, was raised predominantly on the streets of Republic City. This was due to both his parents being killed by a gang-related firebender during their youth. Eventually, however, he and his brother would go on to found and join in a pro-bending team known as the Fire Ferrets, which is how both of them actually went on to meet and join up with Avatar Korra. Together, he, his brother, and his team would work together to stop some of Avatar's most evil and dangerous villains of all time. And sometime along the way, Bolin would actually achieve what very few Earthbenders ever actually could. And that was of course when he discovered that he could actually bend lava, a style of earthbending that is still considered to this day one of the most powerful and dangerous bending styles of all time. Now, we go on to develop a lasting relationship with Opal, Suyin's airbending daughter, which they are believed to have developed even more after the end of the series. But now up next on our list, we have another incredibly powerful lava bender by the name of Ghazan. Now, Ghazan was a member of the Red Lotus and one of very few who actually came close to not only beating but also killing Korra and her entire team. And if we're being truly honest, he might just be one of, if not the most underrated earthbender of all time. Like, this is a guy who triggered an entire temple collapse by simply turning the mountain below it into lava that he could then completely manipulate and control with ease, which to this day is one of the greatest non-Avatar feats that we have ever seen in the entire world of Avatar. Now, down the line, he would of course rather commit suicide with his bending abilities rather than return to the prison that he escaped from. Now, there really isn't much else to really say about him, so let's just quickly move on to the Earthbenders that were a part of the tournament games way back in The Last Airbender. Now, to start us off, we have the Big Bad Hippo. Now, Hippo was initially an earthbending wrestler from the Earth Rumble and one of the people Toph humiliated during her introduction. He displayed a more powerful earthbending style than most, but one that lacked greatly in grace and skill, which of course did match his ungraceful appearance. Now, later he'd go on to become a soldier for his country when he, alongside the mighty Boulder, participated in the invasion of the Fire Nation. However, in the end, the invasion failed and Hippo, along with many others, were captured by the Fire Nation and sent to prison. However, much later, they were freed from captivity and actually seen attending Prince Zuko's coronation at the end of the series. But now, as for the mighty Boulder, well, he was one of the more skilled earthbenders seen in that entire tournament, but again one that lacked any knowledge of neutral Jing, which of course Toph excelled at to the point that although he was quite skilled in his own right, he looked absolutely useless when matched up against her. However, aside from that humiliating defeat, he did go on to display multiple times in the series that he does rank among some of the stronger earthbenders that we have ever seen. So although he may appear completely useless, he does at least deserve a little respect in my opinion. Oh, and a fun fact about him, did you know that he was actually based around and planned initially to be voiced by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson? However, The Rock didn't actually take up that role in the end and instead recommended it to his friend, the incredible Mick Foley, who of course we all know to this day as the true voice of the mighty Boulder. Up next, we have the Fire Nation man, who didn't actually come from the Fire Nation but was actually someone designed to be hated by the audience in order to generate enthusiasm for his defeat. Now, there really isn't a hell of a lot to say about him aside from the fact that he preferred to use dirt-based attacks rather than solid rock ones, and the fact that his design revolved around that of the Fire Nation. Aside from that, he's just another one of the losers that Toph defeated. So of course, with that said, let's just jump over to Sin Fu, who was the promoter and host of the entire Earthbending tournament. He was a proficient and powerful Earthbender and was once actually a competitor in the tournament itself. However, unlike most of the other wrestlers, he was also a business-savvy individual who was always looking for new ways to make money. However, this eventually led him to growing so stubborn and greedy that he was willing to do just about anything to earn money, even going so far as to make deals with the Fire Nation themselves, which is actually what eventually led to his downfall at the hands of Toph, multiple times in fact throughout the entire series. Now next we have Headhunter, the Gecko, and the Gopher, who again were all participants in the tournament, but also characters that aside from their unique character design, don't really have a hell of a lot to say about them. Like sure, the Gopher had a style of bending where he'd normally attack from underground, but that's really about it. Each of them never really get much more screen time than this, and in characters like Headhunter's case, they never even get any lines. So again, with that said, let's just move on to Jianzhu, the Earthbending Master who trained the false avatar Yun and the Earthbending avatar Kyoshi, and someone who's given the name Gravedigger on the account that he has killed over 5,000 men back when he was alive. Now after several years of training Yun and eventually Kyoshi, and after he committed a great deal of crimes and even killed Avatar Kyoshi's adoptive dad, he alongside both Kyoshi and Yun had a standoff, where he was actually subsequently stabbed by Yun and killed. Now he did this due to Jianzhu having left him for dead in a cave a couple of months prior. But now speaking about that and the false avatar Yun, let's just quickly explain him as well. So Yun was found at a young age and believed to be the reincarnation of Avatar Kuruk. They believed this on the account that he displayed similar Paisho skills to the late Avatar. However, as was discovered later on, this was just Jianzhu's lazy attempt at finding the new Avatar as quickly as possible so that he could make lots of money. Now Jun would go on to be trained and raised in the belief that he was the Avatar by Jianzhu, until later, as we just said, it was revealed to be Kyoshi, his best friend and former lover. This was discovered after the two were taken by Jianzhu to an evil spirit deep in a cave, where after Kyoshi was revealed to be the Avatar, Yun was subsequently left by Jianzhu to die, like we of course just mentioned earlier. And also like we briefly mentioned earlier, he'd of course escape from this cave and kill his former master Jianzhu. But what we failed to mention earlier is after doing this, he attempted to kill his two former friends, Rengi and former lover Kyoshi. In its attack, he stabbed Rengi, which forced Kyoshi to have to freeze his heart completely, which of course resulted in his death, making for quite a sad death for a character who really didn't deserve any of the trouble that he ever received. But now moving on, next we have another Earthbender who suffered greatly at the hands of Kyoshi, although this one is very much deserved. It's Qin the Conqueror. Now Qin was an Earthbending warlord who aimed to overthrow the 46th Earthbending king and launch a largely successful conquest of the Earth Kingdom, with his eventual aim being the entire takeover of the entire world. He was an extremely stubborn and proud man and someone that Kyoshi took great pride and honor in absolutely humiliating. You see, after he made his way to her home, she stood her ground and displayed in an immense amount of power just what she was actually capable of. She did this by separating his land from her home and subsequently making what would one day be called Kyoshi Island. However, in doing this, she also accidentally killed Qin, due to part of the remaining land breaking apart beneath his feet. A death she didn't plan in that moment, but one she did confirm later on to Aang that she was planning to accomplish in due time anyway. But now while we're discussing Kyoshi's era and the Earthbenders from it, we just have to mention and explain the Dai Li, a sort of elite Earthbending police force that was founded by Kyoshi herself in order to watch over and protect the Earth Kingdom when she was busy elsewhere. They started off as a group of the most loyal, powerful and trustworthy, but in time went on and as the 100-year war continued, they eventually grew into this disloyal army that would eventually become ruled by Azula and the Fire Nation themselves. However, after the war, they regained some of this trust with the Earth Kingdom and began to serve again as the monarchy's secret police. But now speaking of police forces, let's just talk about the Metal Bending Police Force, also known as the Republic City's Police Department. Now they were basically in charge of the law enforcement in Republic City, and a group made up of predominantly some of the most elite metal bending police officers ever seen. It was founded and run by Toph Beifong prior to her retirement and eventually a group that helped aid and even solve many of the city's biggest issues. And from what we've seen post The Legend of Korra, a group that remained very much the same in almost every single way. Although again with the new Avatar story soon on the way, it's anybody's guess if they really remained true to their law-abiding ways or if they switched off and went evil. You know, given Korra's supposed failure during her time as the Avatar. But now up next and quickly moving on, we have one of the biggest dicks in all of Avatar. And that of course is Fong, the high-ranking officer who served as a general during the final stages of the 100-year-long war, and the guy that threatened to kill Katara and the others if Aang didn't activate his Avatar state. He's a character that was supposedly well-renowned in the world of Avatar, but one that I can't see as anything other than the guy who I personally hoped Aang would kill as a child. Like, he threatened his most beloved. You gotta beat that guy's ass into the ground and make sure he stays there. He's just an absolute dick. I can't see him as anything else. But now I'm starting to go off topic, so let's just move on to Ghashiun and the Sandbenders. They were and still are one of the most formidable tribes in all of the Earth Nation, at least in my opinion, as to fight them within their own territory would almost certainly result in your defeat, as within the desert and through their use of the sand, they can create giant sandstorms and sinkholes, and even create shackles strong enough to hold a giant bison at bay. Plus, when you pair this with the fact that they can also use other earthbending abilities like any other earthbender, it's honestly not hard to see why they are some of the strongest in the entire series. And again, some of the most underrated, because I don't feel like many can see what they can actually accomplish. But again, that's just my opinion. Moving on, next on our list we have Feng, another of the fairly dickish characters in Avatar and the corrupt Grand Secretariat of Ba Sing Se and the leader of the Dai Li. He was a very influential and manipulative individual and someone who lusted for power above all else, which of course eventually led to him making his deal with Azula and the Fire Nation, a deal that would ultimately be his undoing when unsurprisingly Azula double-crossed him and won the loyalty of the Dai Li on her own, claiming the capital of Ba Sing Se in the name of the Fire Nation. Now as for what befell him after the last Airbender and the events of that day, well that's anyone's guess. But I've always liked the idea of him wallowing away deep in the capital like some lonely worm, similar to that of the fate that befell Yan Ra, the murderer of Katara's mother. But now moving on, we start to move towards some of the lesser known and important earthbenders in both series, with the children of Suyin Beifong starting us off. First we have Yuan, the second oldest son of Suyin's kids. He's a sculptor by trade and someone who used his metal bending abilities to create a variety of statues and sculptures that he exhibited in the gardens of Sao Fu. However, despite him being incredibly skilled in the art of metal bending and there being several occasions in which the other members of his family were engaged in conflict, Yuan himself has never actually been seen using his bending abilities combatively at all, which in this world and the series itself is actually kind of impressive to say the least. But now up next we have his two twin brothers Wei and Wing, the inventors of the game known as Power Disc, which is basically a metal bending game where the goal is to get the disc in one of the two nets on either end of the field using your metal bending skills to ricochet the disc against the walls or the pillars situated in the center of the field. It's one of the much more cooler games seen in the Avatar world and one that I really wish was possible to play in the real world, as it looks to be a lot of fun in an incredibly dangerous kind of way. But now aside from that, the two are actually seen quite a bit across the Legend of Korra, aiding in many of the team's missions and actually had quite a bit of skill and talent in both earthbending and metal bending. And honestly, even compared to some of the more notable characters, these two are honestly characters that I miss watching since the show's conclusion, and characters that I do hope have some sort of mention in the new Avatar story, even if it is just a brief mention that they are currently existing somewhere far away. But now moving on, up next we have Tyro and Haru, the earthbending father and son who were imprisoned by the Fire Nation during the 100-year-long war. Now there really isn't a hell of a lot to say about these two characters aside from the fact that they once broke out of prison and helped in the invasion of the Fire Nation on the Day of the Black Sun. However, post that invasion, Tyro did end up back in prison where he remained until the end of the war when he was reunited with his son during the coronation. But that's literally all there is to their story. So that said, and quickly moving on, next we have Yu, who was an earthbending master and resident in the upper class Earth Kingdom town of Gaoling. He was originally Toph's earthbending instructor, but would eventually go on to become a bounty hunter paid to search for and bring back Toph upon her father's request. However, after failing to do this, he went on to return to his teaching profession where it is believed that he remained for the rest of his life. But now up next we have Gao, a corrupt commander of a small group of soldiers stationed in the Earth Kingdom village visited by Zuko during his Zuko Alone adventures. Again, not a very important character by any means, but one that does deserve mentioning just for the simple fact that he was an earthbender. But now finally, to end us off, we just have some honorable mentions appearing on your screen as we speak. These are all earthbending characters, but none of any importance whatsoever and none that I can really be arsed explaining in this video. So just sit back and watch them fly by. But now with all that said and done, that's going to do it for me in this one. If you want to see a video of me explaining every firebender and waterbender ever seen in the Avatar franchise, then click the two video links placed in the description down below. And honestly, while you're down there, you should consider hitting that subscribe button as I would really appreciate it. But again, that's going to do it from me and this one. I hope you all have a great day or night wherever you are, and peace.